A couple of months ago, I announced that I'm developing my own high-end router completely from scratch. But that announcement came with an asterisk, or should I say a condition. I had to raise enough money to make this whole, let's say, endeavor possible. Well, I'm extremely excited to announce that I've secured 180,000 euros, which is not quite $200,000, but more like 194,000. But that would make for an awkward thumbnail, so I hope you'll excuse me for rounding it up to 200k. How long did it take? Well, just over 2 months. But before we start, I have one, for me, very important announcement to make. I found a co-founder. Well, I haven't found him, I've known him for years, but I successfully convinced him to join this project. Now at first, this might not look like that big of a deal, but let me assure you, it definitely is. To find a person who believes in your idea as much as you do and is willing to spend years working hard to turn that idea into reality without any guarantees it actually will, well, let's just say it's really hard. And I've been lucky enough to have succeeded in finding that person twice in my business career. In a way, having a co-founder is like being in a marriage. This person needs to be around both to celebrate the wins and help you minimize the losses or avoid them completely. They have to pick you up when you're down and push you forward when you stray away from the main course. For better or for worse, you could say. Who is it, you might ask? Well, his name is Aljaž and I've mentioned him on this channel before. We worked together on my keyboard project, which made it somewhat easier to onboard him as we already knew each other, or I already know his work ethics and he knows mine. He also has a website which I'll link to in the description down below if you want to check out his previous work. Just know that you can't have him, he's mine. By the way, it's pronounced Aljaž. And my name is pronounced Tomaž. In Slovenia, we have this character above certain letters called a caron. Not Karen, Caron. C-A-R-O-N. Caron, which turns S or S into Sh, turns C or C into Ch, and finally it turns Z or Z into Ž. So, Tomaž and Aljaž. Bueno? Bueno. That was Spanish, by the way. So, why is having Aljaž on board such a big deal? Among other things that we'll get to shortly, because he lives in Eindhoven, Netherlands. For those of you who don't know, Eindhoven is considered the European Silicon Valley, quite possibly in a more literal sense than the US Silicon Valley. Why is that? If you know anything about modern CPU manufacturing, then you know that apart from Intel, pretty much all the modern CPUs and GPUs, including AMD, Nvidia, and Apple Silicon, are manufactured by one company called TSMC, which stands for Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company. And as the name suggests, they're based in Taiwan. But TSMC does not make lithography machines they produce the chips on. Instead, they import them from, you guessed it, Eindhoven, Netherlands, where they are developed and built by a company called ASML, which itself is a spin-off from Philips. Links down below. Why am I telling you all this? Two reasons. First, Aljaž used to work for ASML, which just goes to show what kind of top-tier hardware engineer he is. And second, well, as I mentioned, he lives in Eindhoven, the home of hundreds of thousands of engineers, meaning if, or rather when, we need to hire reinforcements, it'll be much easier to build a development team in Eindhoven than it would be here in Slovenia, where I live. I've actually been there before, so when the need arises for all hands on deck and I need to visit Aljaž to solve a particular problem in person, for example, then I'll of course bring my camera along to show you around. So if you haven't yet, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss that. Okay, now let's talk about the investment and what needs to happen in the following couple of weeks or is already underway. But before we get there, an important disclaimer. I will not mention who the investors are or how much each of them is investing, and there's a couple of reasons for that. First, how much a particular investor decided to participate with is completely irrelevant for you, the viewer. In fact, You could also say it's completely relevant for me. We got over the threshold at which I feel comfortable starting a new company to develop this product, and this is all that really matters at this point. And second, some of the investors aren't institutional investors. They decided to invest because they know me, what I stand for, and they trust in my ability to deliver. Most of them I've known personally for many years, and I know they prefer keeping their privacy. So, unless one of them asks me to make a video about their business, which I'll happily do by the way, I will not disclose any names or numbers. So how are we closing this round? We're not. We're going to use what's known as SAFE, and no, not SAFE as an object, but as an acronym for Simple Agreement for Future Equity. I won't go much into details because I'll also leave the link for that in the description down below so you can check it out for yourself. But what is relevant, or what's relevant for this video, is the flexibility it brings. You see, there's 8 separate investors in total for the 180,000 euros I've raised, and coordinating all of them with their busy private and business lives can be very challenging in order to get them all together to sign those documents and close the round. I mean, they don't even come from the same continent, let alone the time zone. Well, SAFE fixes that, because there is no immediate equity being sold, hence the FE or future equity part of the SAFE. It simplifies the contracts down to a couple of pages, and what's more important, they can all sign this contract completely asynchronously, possibly even months apart, because there's no closing with the SAFE. And that also means that less time and money, of course, is spent on the lawyers, as the contract itself is fairly simple and somewhat standardized, so you simply send it over to the investor and wait for the money to come in. And the benefits don't stop there. Imagine that in 8 to 9 months we start running out of money but aren't quite ready yet with the prototype with which we'd like to raise the next seed round. Well, with SAFE, what we can do is simply pick up the phone, call the investors and ask for an additional, 10, 20 or 50,000 euros we'd need in order to get there. If they agree, they simply receive exactly the same paper they did the first time around, sign it and wire over the money under exactly the same terms and conditions. And I know what you might be asking at this point. What if they don't agree? Well, honestly, if you're transparent throughout the development lifecycle, they will quite possibly anticipate it themselves and offer additional funding before you even have to ask yourself. And not investing would likely mean the end of the road for all parties involved, meaning their initial investment would go pretty much down the drain, which, as you might imagine, is not in their best interest. So, if all that's needed to stay afloat is some 10,000 euros or that kind of order of magnitude, then it likely won't be a big deal. So, when does this initial investment turn into equity? Well, in the next round, which can have many names, such as seed round if the SAFE was pre-seed, it can be Series A if the SAFE was the seed round, and quite honestly, the name isn't as important as the fact that the next round is what is called equity financing. This simply means that in this next round, the shareholders sell some of the shares, and we'll get to them shortly, to an investment fund. I'm not saying investors at this point because usually the numbers in this second round easily hover around $1 million, so the money is usually raised with institutions rather than private businesses or wealthy individuals. As I said, if you want to dig deeper on the topic, I'll leave a couple of the links in the description below, but now that you have a rough idea what's taking place with my project regarding financing, let's also talk about the initial logistics. Obviously, to conduct any kind of business, you first need, well, a company. But even before you have a company, it's a good idea to have an attorney or a law firm that represents that company and advises you on things such as where it makes sense to incorporate and why. You see, the majority of funds in this round comes from the US, and because the US is also the primary and the largest target for the end product, it also makes sense to incorporate in the US. So we're going to do that. In fact, depending on when you watch this video, I already might be a proud owner of a Delaware C Corp. Delaware? I have to get used to that word. With 2 owners, myself and Aljaž. By the way, at the time of recording this video, we're still figuring out the name of the company. We'd like to use the words monolith somehow, maybe monolithic networks, monolith systems, technologies. Write in the comments below what you think about the name or even suggest an alternative. At any rate, make sure to also subscribe so once the company is up and running, you'll learn what we went with. But opening a company isn't enough. In fact, it's just the beginning. Even more so as both the founders, so me and Aliash, are European, which means we'll need what's called a registered agent. Without going too much into details, I'll also link to one such agency in the description. A registered agent is someone that provides a local business address for your company and picks up the official and legal mail on behalf of your business. So, for example, if the IRS, the US tax collection agency, needs to get in touch, they send a letter to the registered agent's address and they get in touch with us or our accountants. Next, we need to come up with a sensible number of initial shares, usually either 1 million for a company that will not seek outside investment or 10 million for a company that will. These numbers, honestly, are completely arbitrary and were recommended to me by the lawyers, and since we are seeking outside investments, I chose 10 millions of shares. 10 million of shares. How much are they worth? Well, almost nothing, but not quite nothing. We agreed on $0.0001 per share, which is also known as par value, which means between me and my co-founder, we have to deposit $1,000 to the company bank account, more on that shortly, in order to receive those 10 million shares of the company. That $1,000 is split according to the percentage of the company each founder gets. So if it's 50-50, then each wires $500, for example. Apart from the shareholders, shares and the business address, there's also a couple of other details that need to be taken care of, such as IP assignment and co-founders agreement. Without going too much into details, because I'm mostly following my attorney's lead, the IP assignment makes sure that all the intellectual property that is produced by the shareholders here in Europe or anywhere else for that matter belong to the company itself, which might sound intuitive, but is important that it's part of the contract between all the people working for the company and the company itself. And second, a co-founders agreement needs to be written and signed. This agreement exists to protect both me and Aliash from one another and the company itself from us should we choose to do anything bad or hurtful for the company. Since I described the relationship between the co-founders to that of a marriage, then the co-founders agreement is pretty much sort of a prenuptial agreement. Basically, it says that both of us will always work in the best interest of the company, won't leave before a certain date, usually years into the future, and what's probably most important, what happens if we violate any of the points in that agreement and to what degree. To ensure all of this, but in particular the premature leaving part, we're doing something called a reverse vesting. In order to understand what that is, let's first talk about traditional vesting, and I will use an example because it's easier to describe it that way. Imagine you get a job at which your new boss offers you a number of company shares if you achieve a certain goal. Most often, that goal revolves around the amount of years you spent at the company, but that's not the rule. Let's say they offer you a vesting period of 4 years with 1 year cliff for say 10,000 shares. This means that in the first year, the cliff year, you receive no shares, but at the end of the year after, you receive 2,500, and the same the year after, and so on until you fully vest your shares at the end of year 5. This means that if you left at the beginning of, say, year 3, you'd leave with 2,500 shares you vested in year 2. So now that you know how traditional vesting works, understanding reverse vesting isn't that hard. It just means we receive all the shares in advance, but lose a certain percentage of them if we leave at any point before those shares are fully vested. Co-founders agreement is the least fun part of starting the company, as you have to think about and discuss all the possible bad ways relationships can end in, but it's far better to do it in advance and be prepared for all these occasions if they happen than the other way around. Plus, no investor will wire money before this document is signed because it also protects them to a degree if you leave. How? Well, because of the reverse vesting, the unvested shares get returned to the company and then redistributed to the rest of shareholders, which includes investors, who can then hire a replacement for the person that left in order to try and save the company so that it can resume or continue day-to-day operations. Okay, from what my YouTube analytics tell me, this is roughly the sweet spot when it comes to video length, so let's call this one part 1. And as things move forward, I'll also prepare the part 2 in which we'll talk about opening a bank account, hiring an accounting company, what the requirements of operating a US-based business from Europe are, and just as important, how much it all costs. And finally, I will announce a secret partner I have also onboarded to this project. One that I'm super excited to have as part of the team, and once you meet them, you will know why. So make sure you're subscribed, and I'll see you in part 2, which might not be the very next video on this channel, as some of these activities take more time than the others, and I want to make sure to wrap them all up before talking about them here on the channel. Tomasz from Slovenia, signing out.